we are in section number 40, the defense of the disciples. Now, in this section, it covers the Pharisees' attempt to call out Jesus on the difference between the manner of Jesus' disciples as distinguished from the disciples of John. Okay, there was a difference in the way they were and their Christian lifestyles had to do with their fasting. Okay, now the Pharisees, they could have had some kind of appreciation for John and his disciples because both John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples, they had prayer and fasting in common. That was one thing that they had in common. In Mark 2:18, we read, "And the disciples of John and the Pharisees used to fast." And that's the connection there. And they come and say unto him, "Why do the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, but thy disciples fast not?" You can see this attitude with the Pharisees. Luke chapter 18, verses 11 to 12 says, "The Pharisees stood and prayed with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possessed." So they did some fasting. And so the disciples of John did the same thing, but not the disciples of Jesus Christ. Okay, Luke 5:33 says, "And they said unto him, Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers? And likewise the disciples of the Pharisees, but thine eat and drink." But thine eat and drink. Okay, so the Pharisees took note that the disciples of Jesus went on eating and drinking, and Jesus took advantage of this in order to compare this to a wedding feast. Luke 5:34, "And he said unto them, Can you make the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them?" Okay, so that's what's at issue in this section of Scripture. And there are a few things that are very instructive for us in the lesson here. So now question number 233 asks the question, why would the Pharisees and the disciples of John fast? It is C, for mourning over sin. Now the answer to this question is not actually derived from Scripture for this passage. If you were to look in the Scripture portion that's associated with this, it does not say anything about mourning. Okay. It says about how the bridegroom is going to be taken from them and they're going to fast at that time, but you don't really see anything about mourning that is taking place here. So the answer to this question is you'd sort of get the answer by process of elimination. Okay, but in this case and from time to time, I actually put some answers in there, and I do this sometimes, not just to derive something from the passages itself, but to use it as a time to be instructive. I use it as an occasion to be able to open up a topic. Now, A and C, okay, to make sure their bodies were rid of toxins or to lose weight for a healthier lifestyle. This refers to the way fasting has been transformed from a spiritual discipline and has been modernized in our times to fit into people's preoccupation with health and fitness and beauty. Okay, that's what people think of in terms of fasting now. In fact, I've had times in the past where I've mentioned that I was fasting, and somebody was thinking, "Oh, you're getting rid of toxins in your body. You're letting your body purge." No, I was fasting for spiritual purposes. Now, the idea of modern fasting would be keeping in line with the promotion of self-interest. You know, people seek achieving some sense of serenity by promoting yoga or fad diets for well-being or for gym and exercise. They can be found in their exercise outfits in the park and cycling on Sunday mornings while Christians balk at having to get dressed and get up and out to Sunday school on time. And there's a lot of ads. There are ads ad nauseum for medications and health care, featuring happy people going about their happy lives at picnics or playing sports. And they have, these medications have very funny names, Truvia and what are some other names that are out there, Nancy? Other medications that we see advertised all the time, we always make fun of. Cedra. Oh, Excedra? Yeah, Billy likes to recognize some of the names. What? Jardiance. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. And you see the people out there, one ad in particular really bugs me because it has this guy, he's bouncing along with everything he does. He's going around, he's at a lawnmower, he's bouncing along as he does his lawn. And, this is what you see. People, they're looking for that medical thing where they're going to be all happy and whatever. And fasting sometimes is used for ridding the body of toxins or for losing weight for a healthier culture, a life that fits into that kind of culture. But the history of fasting for mourning and spirituality has faded away and is forgotten. Okay, so the idea is as you're not eating, which is what fasting is, your body starts to eat itself essentially, okay, and different things start to purge out of your system. And so that's what people use it for today. But fasting really has more of a spiritual quality. Now that's not forgotten entirely. You'll have different cultures that will have different religions that will exercise fasting and things, and they'll recognize the spirituality of it. But you don't really hear about that today. You do hear a lot of things about health concerns. Well, let's look at a set of scriptures here. I've got Jonah chapter 3, verses 5 and 10. We're going to look at what was associated with fasting in the scriptures. And Jonah 3, verses 5 and 10 says, "So the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them even to the least of them. And God saw their works, that they turned from the evil way, and God repented of the evil that he had said he would do unto them, and he did it not." 1 Kings chapter 21. King Ahab was known as a very wicked king. He brought in Baal worship into Israel. They'd had the golden calf, or they had the calves at the northern and southern ends of Israel, but now Ahab made it worse. He brought in Baal worship. But even he, when he was confronted with the time, listen to what happened to him. 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 27 to 29 says, "And it came to pass, when Ahab heard those words, that he rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his flesh, and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house." Ezra chapter 8, verse number 21. Ezra says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance." And then Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. When Nehemiah was before the king, he heard what was happening to Israel, and it says in verse number 4, "And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven." Okay, Esther chapter 4, verse 3. "And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes." Psalm 35, verse 13. It says, "But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned into mine own bosom." And finally, Daniel chapter 6 and verse 18. Let me make sure I got this going here. Daniel chapter 6, verse 18. This is the king with Daniel in the lion's den. It says, "Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions." Typically, what people will do for fasting today is, it's kind of taught that it's sort of there for sharpening our focus spiritually. Okay, one of the things that happens as we're eating is that the blood tends to go into your digestive system to handle the digestion, which means you have less blood for your brain. I'm sorry? Exactly. That's why I was just going to say. That's why we get sleepy after we eat, is because there's less oxygen going up there. In some cultures, they have the siesta after the afternoon meal, and that's why. And I can appreciate that little factor. But it's so you have the idea of, if you're fasting, your blood flow is more available to the rest of your body, and every time the hunger pangs hit, you say, "Wait a second. That's a reminder that I should pray." But it really shouldn't just be for a question of sharpening ourselves spiritually, sharpening our focus spiritually. You'll notice in all of these passages, in every one of them, when fasting was mentioned, they were having a time of mourning as well, a time of sorrow over sin and over conditions. Especially as we get into every election time. It really happens just about every election. It talks about how Christians ought to be praying and fasting. And we might take that a little bit less seriously because we're not in the habit of fasting, but maybe that is a discipline that we should get into, as a time of fasting and considering our souls before God. Let's pass out these microphones here. Give you that one there. Send one back to Miss Nancy, okay? And you can hold on to one of them, okay? Okay, Miss Nora, yes.
Do you also do fasting when, like, for example, we have like as a church would like to pray for, like a big project that we would like to do, like, like for example, we need a building or something like that. Fasting is in order, like for the a group to come together also, and maybe at the same time they will be praying, and at the same time they will be fasting.
Yeah, that's the spiritual focus sharpening I was talking about. What I'm also pointing out is that maybe there should also be a time when we deliberately, for a sense of revival, have the time of fasting and mourning over our sin, preparing our hearts for the revival. Okay. So question 234 is based on John 3:29. It says, "He that hath the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy therefore is fulfilled." And so that was John the Baptist, of course, talking here. And he's bringing out a lesson for us to understand about the bridegroom. So the question is, why would a bridal party be excused from fasting? It is B, because the coming wedding would be a cause for joy and not for mourning. Now C, because it would not look right if they were suffering from hunger, okay, highlights how people place a lot of significance on appearance. It's not just a question of appearance. In fact, if anything, Jesus talks about when you're fasting is to wash your face and go out so you don't have the appearance of fasting, because somebody could be, and if they were fasting normally, it could be, look at me, I'm just so downtrodden, see how holy I am, I'm fasting. So Jesus talks about the appearance. Don't make it look like you're fasting, looking for attention. People's response should be sincere and genuine. A is wrong, okay, because they would have been very busy. A is wrong because it suggests that people can be excused from spiritual responsibility. Well, I'm getting ready for the wedding. I'm too busy to do the things that I'm supposed to be doing. Okay? It's not just a question of having a convenient excuse to accommodate their comforts and their convenience. Okay, now, B might be construed that their response was due to inconvenience. Okay, they were having a party, but the question is of having an appropriate response. The appropriate response at the time of the wedding is to be rejoicing. In fact, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 and 4 says, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." And so there's what Solomon's bringing out here is that for the children of the bridegroom, it's important that they spend the time rejoicing. That's the appropriate response for that kind of time. Okay, question 235 is based on Matthew 9:15. 9:15 says, "And Jesus said unto them, Can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then shall they fast." Okay, so how did Christ use this occasion to prophesy of his crucifixion? A, yes, A, he warned them that the bridegroom was to be taken away. Jesus did not teach a positive thinking kind of religion as is implied in B, okay? He didn't tell them that they'll have joy as long as they don't fast anymore. It's like the old Henny Youngman joke, "Doctor, doctor, it hurts when I do this." The doctor says, "Well, don't do that anymore." Problem solved. So it's not just a question of, well, don't fast and then you'll be joyful all the time. A lot of times people think that Christians are supposed to just have joy. They should never have a time of mourning. In fact, they'll be told, "Oh, you should be brightening up. You're at a funeral." And they say, "Why are you crying?" "Because my husband just died." Of course I'm going to cry. There's a time for crying, right? But it's not just a question of having positive thinking. To replace an old bride with a new bride, as C suggests, would be to prophesy that the Old Testament saints have no place in the bride of Christ. Okay, so it's not just a question of saying, well, you had the old bride, Israel, and now you've got the new bride, which is going to be the church. Everything is really all blended together when it comes to the return of Christ. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 14. Okay, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country." Then jump down to verse 39. And these all the ones that were seeking the new country, all of the Jews of the Old Testament, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. You see, we received the promise. The promise was that Jesus would come. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So you see, God's promise for that new heavenly country was to encompass the old bride and the new bride. Actually, it's not an old bride and new bride. It was just all one thing that's going to be the bride of Christ. In fact, turn over to Ephesians chapter 2 for that. The Old Testament saints were not being discarded in favor of a whole new organization. I will tell people that we are as a church what Israel was supposed to become. It was supposed to be turned into this. And this is evident in Ephesians chapter 2, verse number 11. He says, "Wherefore remember that ye, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Paul here is pointing out the distinction between Israel, between the Jews and Christians. In fact, the first several chapters of Ephesians is where Paul is dealing with the problem of the Jewish-Gentile separation. You want to remember that Ephesus, and the Ephesian church there, Ephesus was the seat of a very powerful shrine for Diana. And so this was a major religious center for the pagans. You also had a very large Jewish community there, and they were very oftentimes at odds with the Gentiles of that city. And so when Paul's writing this letter to the Ephesians, he's pointing out this old separation that was there. In fact, the Gentiles sort of resented the Jews because they were exempt from the tax that was used in order to pay for the pagan temple. And the Gentiles were like, you got this tax exemption. Also, Jews were exempt from conscription, from the draft for the army. And so there were some resentments there. And so as Gentiles started getting saved, Paul is addressing them to point out how that you're supposed to erase that border between you, and it's supposed to be Jew and Gentile together in the church. So you didn't have the Jews as if it's some old bride that's being cast aside in order to make way for the new bride. What you have is just a continuation of what God's work was supposed to be. And so he says that at that time, verse number 12, you were without Christ. You who? You Gentiles, you were without Christ. Okay, you were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. In other words, you were unclean, you were set apart, you were not part of Israel. You were strangers from the covenants of promise. Israel had a certain number of covenants that had been given to them, promises of the land to be given to them. And so the Gentiles didn't have any part in those covenants, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. So the Gentiles who had been far off from all the things that were associated with Israel and with the people of God, because of Jesus Christ, they are now made close instead. For he is our peace. Remember, the word peace in Greek has the idea of bringing two things together, of reconciling things, joining them. For he is our peace, who hath made both one. Both who? Both Jew and Gentile were made now one in the church, and hath broken down the middle of the wall of partition between us. You see, back in the temple, there was a wall there. You had Gentile converts, but as Gentile converts, they were not allowed to go any further into the temple area. Only the Jews could pass there. And that little wall was now removed so that Jew and Gentile were to be one. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in the ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. Okay, so C is definitely wrong, because it wasn't, okay, we're going to get rid of the Jews, now we're going to have the Gentiles only in the church. Now, A points out that Jesus was going to be taken in the crucifixion, and that's the right answer, of course. He warned them that the bridegroom was going to be taken away. We go through times of spiritual fasting until the time that Jesus becomes for his bride, and then there's going to be a great wedding feast. So since Jesus was taken away, now we have the times of fasting. But then comes the great wedding feast. Matthew chapter 26, verses 26 to 29. Whenever we go to take communion, we read, I typically use, starting in Matthew 26, 26, and I'll read down to as far as 28, but that verse 29 is extra significant. So they were having communion, and then verse number 29 says, "But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So we're looking forward to a big old party when we get up there. In the Revelation in chapter number 19, it describes that party, and it's a wedding feast. Revelation 19, starting in verse number 6, says, "And I heard as it were the voice of a great multitude, and as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of mighty thundering, saying, Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen in the righteousness of saints. And he said unto me, Right, blessed are they which are called into the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, these are the true sayings of God. And so, Mr. Alex, you got your wedding gown ready? Wait a second, Pastor, wedding gown? Okay. Well, the church is the bride of Christ. There's going to be this wedding feast where God brings his bride to him. This is one of the reasons why marriage is such a significant thing for Christians. Marriage had its elevation in the Christian communities. Before that time, pederasty, which is men having boy toys essentially, or other different relationships. Marriage was not necessarily so kept, but womanhood and marriage was elevated through Christianity, and especially so because when we look at marriage, we recognize that it's a picture of something heavenly. It's a picture of God and his church being joined together. And so that's one reason why we have monogamy. It's one husband, one wife. Jesus said that's the way it was supposed to be from the beginning. And so that also, when we start to mess around with the marriage relationship, what we're doing is we're giving a bad testimony about God. Typically, when I go to do marriage counseling, as I'll point out, Alex, your day's coming, I trust. Okay, don't worry, you're young enough right now. Okay, but let's say in the day that you go to get married, I'm going to explain. I'm going to teach you that marriage is for keeps. Okay, because it represents something heavenly, and you don't mess around with the symbols that God has in place. So it becomes extra significant to us as believers. Okay. Question 236 is based on Mark chapter 2, verse 21. No man also seweth a piece of new cloth on an old garment, else the new piece that filled it up taketh away from the old, and the rent is made worse. So how did Jesus describe the new dispensation that was coming? Okay, as a new cloth that should not be patched onto the old cloth. We are not here fixing the old dispensation of the law. There is a replacement. You can turn over to Hebrews chapter 10, and we're going to look at that in a moment. A is wrong. Okay, as a new bride replacing the old bride, we're repeating that concept. A is wrong because it refers to replacement theology, in which people believe that God has no more use for the Jews. Okay, C suggests that there is a mere continuance of the old dispensation. Okay, as old wine in old wine in old bottles. New wine in the old bottles would cause them to split. Because there'd be a certain amount of expansion in an old dried out bottle, a leather bottle, essentially, a wine skin that they would use would tend to get to be rent. Now, it's an interesting thing about the new cloth patched onto the old. Mr. Alex, have you been taught how to do laundry yet? Yeah. You have, okay. Now, I'm not a good laundry person. I don't know enough about laundry. I know this, though, that if I'm not careful, there are certain things, if you put them in the wash on a hot water cycle, you come out with a shirt that's lifted up to here, okay? It shrinks somehow. In fact, they sell different kinds of clothes as different kinds of jeans as pre-shrunken jeans. What they do is they take that cotton fabric and they pass it through. Ladies, you got to help me with this here a little bit, okay? If I get this wrong, just raise your hand, okay? But that cotton fabric, goes through a time of being compacted as it gets heated up, and then the fabric will shrink. Well, if you try to have an old garment that's all going through the shrinking process, then what happens is if you put and it's going to be stretched as it will, and you put a new patch on there that's not going through the shrinking process, when it goes through the shrinking process, it'll pull the stitches away from the old, already pre-shrunken stuff. And so this is something that they were very much familiar with there in the New Testament times. In fact, one of the processes for the tent makers would be they would weave the fabric for making tents, and then it would go through just the time when they would get wet. They would shrink it, which would cause the fabric to tighten up and become waterproof. And that's one of the things that tent makers did. So it's not a question of the old dispensation being done away with completely. Okay, there's a new dispensation coming up, and the new dispensation brings things about. Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse number 1, it says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. For then would they have not ceased to be offered, because if the worshippers once purged should have had no more conscience of sins." In the new dispensation, the sacrifice of the new dispensation did take away sins completely. The sacrifice of the new dispensation was perfect, and it lasted forever. It was different from the sacrifices of the Old Testament. Now, I'm saying it this way because, Alex, I'm going to guess that this might be hard to try to exactly figure out. What do we mean when we say dispensation? I'm using some terms that need to be defined here. Okay, a dispensation means a time period that is marked by the way in which God works in that time period. Do we have sacrifices today? Well, when have you seen me take a lamb and... No, okay. Very good, yeah. Kind of is actually a good answer because there's the sacrifices of a penitent heart that we bring to God. But as far as the way God works in his organization today, we don't do sacrifices. In another age, and another dispensation, in God's organized work, they did have sacrifices. So the question comes out, why don't we have sacrifices today? What changed? Well, what changed was this. It says the law having a shadow of good things to come. So back in the time when the law from Moses, the law of sacrifices, when that was there, that was just a rough picture of the sacrifice that was going to come in our dispensation. The sacrifice that is in our dispensation is Jesus Christ on the cross. Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. So you have these animals that were sacrificed. They couldn't take away sins. If they could take away sins according to this passage, then you would have stopped having them. But Jesus, because he's the perfect sacrifice, there's no more sacrifices needed. So in the old dispensation, those things were just like object lessons, kind of, to say to the Jews, someday we're going to have a perfect sacrifice. That would be kind of like me doing one of my little tricks for the kids. And I'm not actually doing and changing anything. I'm just sort of hiding things in my hands and hiding up my sleeve and things like that. Putting in my pocket when they're not looking. And so what happens is those are object lessons. Well, the sacrifices of the Old Testament, they were object lessons to say, one day the perfect sacrifice is going to come. So this is talking about the old cloth is the old dispensation. In the new dispensation, we do something entirely different in that it is perfect. It is not entirely unrelated in that it's related to the Old Testament sacrifice, but it's perfect. The demands of the law gave way to the fulfillment by grace, and so you can't weave them together. This is what the Galatians had a problem with. The Galatian church, when you read the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul is trying to point out to them, hey, you guys are still trying to use these Old Testament laws. No. We have grace now. These things are all fulfilled. We're not going to go back to the law. You can't put them together. So that's what the Galatians had a problem with. They were trying to blend the Old Testament dispensation with the New Testament. Okay, and our last question, number 237. It's based on Luke 5:39. No man also having drunk old wine straightway desireth new, for he saith the old is better. And so the question is, how did Jesus use the old wine to describe how people might respond to the new dispensation that was coming? Okay, so people, how would they respond to the new dispensation? The answer is A, people might prefer the old dispensation that they're used to. Now, what happens here is that Luke, out of these three gospel writers, Luke is the only one that records this. Okay, he's the only one that adds this factor in. Okay, you had the new wine in the old bottles, but then all of a sudden, Jesus switched to say that sometimes people might just want they might want the old wine. They don't want the new at all. Okay, there are going to be people who are what you call early adopters. What's an early adopter? Anybody know what an early, Miss Nancy, microphone? It's not going on? Oh, there it goes, okay.
I'm supposing that means people that are quick to jump on anything new.
Yeah. And they usually especially talk about that with technology, but it could be anything new. It could be fads, right? Okay. Yeah. People like to rush into new things, and so they'll be early adopters. Well, only some people are like that. You know, a lot of people just want to keep things the way they were. Some fads, got to be careful to be an early adopter. Somebody has said, for preachers, don't be the first to adopt a new fad, and don't be the last to give it up. I remember when leisure suits were all the fad. Alex, go Google leisure suits sometime. You'll see why it was a short-lived fad. They did not look good. Don't be quick to take it on, and don't be the last one to give it up either. Other fads like suits with shorts. Sometimes we'll see there'll be some kind of meme that'll come across as you're doing stuff on the internet, and you'll see just these bizarro outfits. It's all got to do with trying to get the androgynous look. Well, some looks are not androgynous. They are sickly absurd, like men in sarongs. That was a fad. And you can see some very weird things that are out there. Now, I should be careful about suits with shorts, because down in Bermuda, it's not a fad. It's a thing. Okay. Now, if you're living in those kind of temperatures, it's maybe a good thing besides. But up here, nah, okay? There's another fad that didn't pan out was a phone with a built-in razor. Okay, can you imagine? You're talking, and while you're talking, you just shave a little bit. The ladies can't appreciate that. Okay? Electrified water was a fad. Somehow it changed things if you ran an electric current through it. And I think it had an automatic cutoff thing so you couldn't get electrocuted. Well, no, electrolytes are different. Electrified water is just you stuck a battery in the water, and it's supposed to remove toxins from your system. Okay. Some fads should never have lasted as long as they did, like boom boxes on your shoulder. Okay. How about the mullet haircut? Okay. Oh man, it's nice that they're getting. Well, I guess they're getting away from it. I don't know. How about platform sneakers? Platform sneakers. Okay. Now, C refers to how people give up too quickly when trying to grow spiritually. Look at C. People will get frustrated by having to figure things out, so they'll give up altogether. Well, we've got to be careful of that. Just because when you go to the newness of faith, you get saved, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming for people, all the things that they see in church and all, and they just say, this is just too much, I'm going to drop out. You've got to be careful of that also. According to A, people might prefer the old dispensation that they used to. Jesus pointed out how that people tend to stay with things that they are familiar with. This is especially a problem when people change to become a Christian. It has to be pointed out how everyone changes all the time from one day or year to the next. I'll have people say, oh, I don't think I can convert to becoming a Baptist. I said, well, yeah, don't convert to becoming a Baptist. How about convert to become a Christian? Well, no, I don't do that one either. But I'll explain to people, it's not a question of converting to Baptists. It's a question of growing in your faith. And then the more you find you align yourself with Bible doctrine, you say, wow, I'm a Baptist. I can't remember who it was. I think it was the governor of New Mexico was challenged by, I can't remember who. This is just coming into my head now in recollection. And she was challenged to examine what her stands were, and she just came to the conclusion, wow, I'm a Republican, because she started looking at the issues and realized that she agreed with the platform of the Republicans rather than the platform of the Democrats. Does this sound familiar to you? Yes. Linda Martinez, okay. Okay, you don't remember which presidency it was happening in? Oh, George W. Bush, okay. I was thinking it was Reagan, but that sounded like it was too far back to me. Yeah, George W. Bush. Okay, so we should be committed to developing our faith, which will require that we cast off the old things that are proven to be problematic. Sometimes I'll say to somebody who's newly getting saved, and I'll explain to them, listen, would you do anything that God asked of you? And they say, oh yeah, I would do anything God asked of me. I said, now mind you, if it was clear that it was from God, if God asked you to go jump in a lake, would you do it? Oh yeah, if God asked me to go jump in a lake, I would do it. I said, okay, God did ask you to go jump in a lake. And I said, what? And I said, yeah, baptism. Okay, you're going to need to get baptized. Because that's a little bit strange to them. They think of that as a little odd. They think the word baptized means you get a little water sprinkled or poured on your head. The word baptism doesn't even mean that at all. So I say, well, yeah, you're not getting baptized again. You weren't baptized the first time. What you had was rantism, not baptism. Rantism? Is there such a thing? No, I kind of just made it up. See, the word in Greek for sprinkle is rantizo. And the Greek word for baptize is baptizo. Okay, so you might get rantized, but you're not baptized. And so you need to go and do it the right way for the first time. So you have this picture that Christ is doing. He's talking about the transition. He's talking about the transition from the Old Testament into the New. Let me make a note to myself here. Note to self. So Jesus is using the occasion of this fasting issue for him to bring out the fact that things are not the same as they were, that a change is happening, and that they needed to be rejoicing while Jesus was there. The time was going to come for fasting, okay, when the bridegroom is taken away, but we should rejoice while we can.